Hello everyone, welcome once again to my channel called Days of Hope. My name is Sakshi Nelson. I hope you all are doing good and God's grace has kept you safe and you are doing well with your families. Thank you to all my subscribers and viewers who have been watching and listening to my messages. Thank you for sending me comments and messages as words of encouragement, and uh, I certainly look forward to make videos, but it is only when the Lord speaks to me something specifically, it is then I really feel the urge to share it with all of my viewers. And so I have been getting this constant nudge from the Lord, and He has been telling me and talking to me continuously about blessings and covenant, and our testimonies along with it. Is our living life a testimony of blessedness, or is it a living testimony of covenant? And for some reason, God keeps taking me back to Genesis, and it's one of the most interesting books because that is where all the deep and dense and you know the messages from God have great meanings, and it amazes me that how God has hidden messages right in the book of Genesis. And so, without wasting any time, I would like to take your attention and I would like to talk first about the testimony of blessedness. And so we start from the first book of the Bible, that is the book of Genesis, chapter 1. We know the story amazingly, we know the story thoroughly, we remember it. It is the story of the 7-day creation, and we read particularly that when God finished his work, when God ended his work, when God created everything in the Garden of Eden, in God's garden, he blessed it. So creation is a symbol of blessedness. That means blessedness leads to sanctification. For whatever God made in the Garden of Eden, it was all clean, it was pure, there was no sin, there was no filth, it was pure, because everything was made by the word of God and by the living hands of the living God. So first point, blessedness leads to sanctification. And once God sanctifies something, it is totally up to us that how we maintain that sanctification. If we see the example of Lucifer, Lucifer was, according to the book of Genesis and in the book of Yeshaya, we see the history of what Lucifer was. And Lucifer was a main and very important angel of God. He used to stand on the mountain of God and guard it in the Holy of Holies, in the holiest place. And right there, Lucifer, blessed creature, a perfect angel made by the living God, a sanctified angel, stood in the most holiest of places, and there he destroyed his sanctification by his own hands. He sinned in his heart. So sanctification is something that comes from God. Blessing leads to sanctification. God gives us a clean, pure, sanctified blessing, but it is up to us how we maintain it. And so we see how Lucifer ruined his sanctification, and God threw him from heaven and sent him to the deepest parts of the earth. Also, we see that Satan in the New Testament spoils or probably tempts Jesus when Jesus was fasting for 40 days. He went to Jesus to tempt him, not because he did not know who Jesus was, but he wanted to place that seed of temptation so that the Holy Son, the Son who was sinless, Jesus who had no fault in his heart, the seed of temptation, the sanctified Son of God, would ruin it. And it was not possible because Jesus was the Son of God. And so we see the story, that conversation that happens between Jesus and Satan. So remember one thing, blessedness leads to sanctification. Number two, we also see that Adam and Eve, when God created Adam, He created Adam pure. He made it in His own image. He made him in His likeness. And something that is made in God's likeness can never sin. But Eve was made from Adam. And so, she being the weaker vessel, it became easy for her to lose that blessedness, to lose that grace of God, and she sinned. She sinned by disobeying God. She sinned by disobeying God. And from there, we know the entire story. When she disobeys God, she encourages Adam to do the same, and the sanctification leads the sanctification, or their blessedness is wasted away. Their eyes are opened, they see their nakedness. So basically, when you are sanctified, when you're made holy, when you're made pure from the hands of God, you would never see yourself as naked. But once the sanctification, or once the blessedness was gone, once they disobeyed God, they saw their nakedness. Number two, blessedness or blessings are God's grace. Blessings or blessedness is a part of God's grace. So if we hold a testimony of blessings in our life, it is only because it is God's grace upon us. It has nothing to do with our works. It is not that because we are sinless. It is not because we are righteous or holy. No, it is only because of God's grace. And that was the first thing that Adam and Eve lost in the Garden of Eden. God sent them out of the Garden of Eden. And once grace is given, it is our job to maintain it. It is our job to hold on to that grace, not to take advantage of it by fearing the living God. When we fear a living God, we hold on to that grace. And we know very well that at the moment, in this hour, we are living under God's grace. Number three, blessedness or blessings add multiplication. That is fruits in our life. For the same, we are going to read Genesis chapter 1, verses 28. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves on the earth." God gave us the right to multiply, to be fruitful, to spread, to have dominion. God gave us dominion over everything. And so blessedness adds to multiplication in our life, fruits in our life. So I want you to focus. This is really important. What kind of a testimony are we having if God has given us the blessedness? Number one, blessedness leads to sanctification. Number two, blessedness or blessings are God's grace. Number three, blessedness or blessings add multiplication. That means the fruits in our life. When we take advantage of God's grace, when we make ourselves unholy, we are in the same situation as Adam and Eve were right there in the Garden of Eden. Because God gets really hurt when we don't maintain our sanctification, when we don't maintain the gift of God, grace, when we don't understand our dominion, the authority that the living Father has given us. God takes it away. God takes away the blessedness. So ponder over this. Ponder over the testimony of blessings. Number two, the testimony of covenant. The testimony of covenant. Number one, covenant requires an altar of sacrifice. Covenant requires an altar of sacrifice. And so, again, we are still in Genesis, where we see that God made covenant with Noah, Abraham, Abimelech, and various others. But here we are only going to talk about two of the main and the prominent characters in the Bible. God made a covenant or required an altar of sacrifice first from Noah. The biggest sacrifice that God has had to give was to destroy everything that God Himself created from His own hands. The Bible says the Lord was hurt that He made man. The Lord was so hurt that He washed off the face of the earth with flood. He had to cleanse the earth, the living, the creatures of the air, the creatures of the sea, the creatures of the land. Everything died. And only Noah and his family was alive in the ark of God. It required a sacrifice. It is not good, or it is not convenient. It should not be convenient for us to say, oh, that God was very angry and He washed off the face, and there was water spread over the face of the earth, and the heavens were opened, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Yes, of course, it was the wrath of God, but at the same time, God was so hurt. God has feelings. So coming back to that, God made a covenant with Noah, and number two, God made a covenant with Abraham by asking his only beloved son, Isaac. Of course, Abraham and Isaac got the gift of the son that was promised to Abraham, and God gave them Isaac, even though Sarah was past the age of childbearing, but God promised, and He required a sacrifice. Of course, it does not denote God's cruelty, but God wanted to test Abraham. So my question to you is, what is our sacrifice on the altar if we want to make a covenant with God? If we want to make a covenant with God, or if we want God to make covenant with us, we need to prepare an altar of sacrifice. Is your all the altar? Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 says that. Is your all the altar? Our life should be a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable in the sight of the living God. And what covenant did God made with Noah? That never ever he would destroy his own creation. And then God made a covenant with creation. Not up till now. This is really interesting, that when God made the entire universe, or when God was in the process of 7-day creation, God did not make a covenant then. God blessed it. But it is amazing that God chose Noah and Abraham and made covenant with them, and especially with Noah, that never he would destroy the face of the earth, and never he would destroy it with flood or waters. And for that we have verses. He gave them as a sign in the sky. And of course we see Abraham. Abraham was the only son. Isaac. He went on the mountain to give his only son because God demanded of it. Next, covenant lifts up the curse and gives a promise. Covenant lifts up the curse and gives a promise. Covenant always comes with a promise. Just like I said before, when you are ready to give, when you're willing to sacrifice, God in return will always make a promise. We see that in Genesis chapter 9 verses 11 to 16. I will read it for you. It's really interesting. Genesis chapter 9 verses 11 to 16. Thus I established my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Of course, you can read this particular verse, chapter 9, verses 11 to 17. It is a covenant that Noah, or God and Noah, made with each other, and God gave a promise. And similarly, when Abraham laid his only son on the altar, God gave him also a promise. For that, we will see Genesis chapter 15, verses 4 and 5. This is really beautiful, how God works in an amazing pattern. And behold, the word of the Lord came to Abraham, saying, This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body, he shall be your heir. Then he brought him outside. God brought Abraham outside and said, Look now towards heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. Can you even think of counting the stars in the sky? I love star watching. I love sky gazing. And no human has ever had we cannot count the stars. They are infinite. They are beyond our reach. And God said, Come, look out in the sky. That will be the number of your descendants. And so you and me are the descendants of Abraham. You and me are the covenant that came with the promise, because Abraham was willing to lay his only son in the altar. And this is, of course, symbolic, because similarly, we see that Father Abraham symbolizes the Father in heaven, who is willing to sacrifice his only son, Jesus, for paying the sins of the world. And so the covenant was turned to grace. But yet the promise lives on. We are the descendants of Abraham, and we are spread from nations to nations. In the ends of the world, to the corners of the world, we have descendants of Abraham, and God is maintaining that promise. Number 3, covenant is from generations to generation. Covenant is not for a short time, it is from generations. Can you imagine the generation that started from Abraham and till today? It's really not easy to study that. It is, if you open the book of the history of the descendants, you would be amazed. It is impossible to remember. But of course, there are various books and various channels on YouTube. You'll find that it is simplified and made. But my point is that God kept his promise, and the covenant that God made with Noah and Abraham is valid till today, and will be valid till we see the living God when he comes to take us to heaven. So question this again to yourself. Is your life a testimony of covenant, or is your life a testimony of blessedness? Because covenant requires an altar of sacrifice. Covenant lifts up the curse and gives a promise. And covenant is from generations to generations. And very interestingly, I will take your attention to Genesis chapter 17, where God speaks amazingly to Abraham. And this is the distinction or the difference between the testimony of blessedness and the testimony of covenant. So listen here what it says. Genesis chapter 17, verses 20 and 21. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him. I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, which also applies to 12 nations, and I will make him a great nation. This was a testimony of blessedness. And the testimony of covenant, verse 21. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear. To you at this set time next year. Isn't that amazing? God is very clear of the difference between the testimonies that we hold. Are we just satisfied by having the testimony of blessedness? Or are we looking forward to have a covenant with Jesus, covenant with the living God? And so I wrote this line. Are we living a testimony of blessedness, or are we living a testimony of covenant? It is a question that you need to ask yourself. For blessedness can lead you to God, but covenant will lead you to the promised land. For blessedness is for a short while, but covenant is eternal. I hope you got the context of what I am trying to share with you. This is the living testimony. Our lives are a living testimony. And we are under the influence of blessings and covenant. And so what kind of testimony are you living with? And what do you leave behind with you when you face the living God? So ponder over it and do understand. Please read the book of Genesis. Go through chapters 1 to 20. There are amazing things, beautiful things that Lord reveals when you read His word again and again and again with spiritual eyes. And so I would like to end this video here, and hoping to make a video next time when God gives me something amazing yet again to share with you. And thank you so much for being my subscribers, and God bless you all. Thank you so much. Much love. Bye-bye.